What's up everyone, my name is Travis Nilsson and this is Dev Tips, a YouTube channel where we look at web design and development, and today we're starting a new series called CSS Animation Series. Now the way this series breaks down is that we're going to have two principal episodes, and by principal I mean we're going to be talking about the functionality, the syntax, the ideas behind making this all work. What are the principles involved in making the animations in CSS happen? And then after that, we're going to have a few episodes, more practical episodes. And in those episodes, I'm going to go over like the things that you should be animating. Because there's some things that don't need to be animated that I see animated a lot. And I want to go over and give you some good recommendations and show you practical examples of what and how and why you should be animating certain things and not other things. But that will come later. And I don't know how many of those will be. It'll just be like a continue to do them until I'm bored of them kind of situation. But this is the first of the two principled episodes. But before we go into the how of CSS animation, I want to go into the what am I talking about when I say CSS animation or animation on the web, okay? So animation kind of breaks down into these two ideas. The first idea is to give something life, right? You like Dr. Frankenstein has this monster and gives it life, he animates it. Right? The second one is what we really want to be looking at today, is to give something the appearance of having movement. And the key here is really movement. Okay? So in CSS, there are two main ways that we move things around the page. The first one is what this video today is going to be covering. It's the transition property. This is the how we animate with CSS. The first one is using the transition property. The second one is by using the animation property, and you have to couple that with this other idea called keyframes, and we're going to get into that in next week's video or the next video that I create. But right now we're going to be looking at the transition property, and then after both of these two, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a few videos that are planned, and they're going to be talking about the elements that you should be animating, and we're going to take a little bit more of a UX stance on that, what you should animate because it's good for the user and what you should not animate because it's ridiculous and dumb. Sound fun? Okay, on to the first episode. Today we're going to be talking about the transition property, and this is part one of the CSS animation series. So let's first take a look at how it's written. What's the syntax of transitions in CSS? How do we write them? Let's break them down like this. We declare this transition on an element. And the element it's at the blue right there, the element, in this case that's a class called element, the thing that we call this transition on will be the thing that's going to be transitioned, or the thing that's going to move, okay? And how we write that is there's a few parameters, there's a few values for the property of transition. The first value of the property is the other property that's going to animate. And that'll make sense in a second. The second one is duration. How long is this transition happening? And the third one there is ease. I say ease because timing function didn't kind of fit in the line. I wanted to keep it on one line. But you can think of it as timing function or ease. Basically, this is the how is that transition distributed across time? Is it ease in, out, ease in? You could even use things like cubic Bezier or steps with transition. So it's pretty cool. And then the last one is delay. How long should this wait before the animation, or in this case the transition, starts happening, okay? And you would write it out something like this. Here's an example of how this would be written. Transition opacity, and the green there is the property of the element that we're animating. So if there's a bunch of element properties like height and width and color, all those things will not get transitioned, only opacity. You could even write the keyword, instead of writing opacity in green, you could write all. That means everything will get this same transition. Okay, after transition, you write the orange, which is time, so transition the opacity over 300 milliseconds, and use a timing function of ease in, out, but wait until after 1 second has passed before this transition starts. Does that make sense? This is the formula for how we're going to write transitions. This is the syntax. And you can actually add more than one transitions onto any given element. If you would just, where that semicolon is right there, just change that for a comma and then repeat the green, orange, pink, and blue, and then end with the semicolon, right? So you can have you can transition different properties. So like if this is opacity and we wanted to also transition the background color, you would write this again, but the green would say background color, right? I hope that explains itself. So that is the syntax of CSS transitions. And you notice that in this example, opacity is the property. So let's talk about properties. What can we animate and what can we not animate? Because there are some things that just don't make sense to be animated, right? Or they're just not even able to be animated. So animatable properties, okay? Things like font size, background color. I have listed here width and like left, which is how far from the left something is positioned. These things would make sense, obviously, if you change the value of these properties, that some kind of visual change would happen. If you change the font size from 14 pixels to 28 pixels, you can see that there's going to be an animation that happens there. There is distinct traversal of the values that can happen. Width from 28 pixels to 100 pixels wide, you could see that thing growing, right? Background color, you can see the color changing. Those things are animatable properties, and this list of 4 is not all of them. There's actually there is a list of all of them, and I'll link to that in the description below. But basically, just think of it as anything that you can imagine changing, you can most likely animate it, okay? But here are some things that you cannot animate. Just as an example to help you understand the difference, right? So we have display. Can you imagine something visually changing from display block to inline block? What would that look like, right? Can you imagine visually something changing position relative to absolute? You could see that there's a difference in the way it will display, but how would you transition from relative to absolute? You can't do that, right? You can't animate the font family from Helvetica to I was going to say Arial, but you kind of can do that now. Helvetica to Georgia or something. You can't like animate the characters. It just doesn't work. You have to switch them out. There's no animation that can happen there, right? So a lot of properties are animatable, and some are not, and that's just what I want to explain here. Now, when you're considering animatable properties, you have to consider what properties are the best properties to animate. In other words, performance, right? You have to consider performance because animation takes a lot of work to do. We're moving things around on the screen. We're making things go whiz and bang. And are we animating the right thing, right? And there's going to be some links down below, some references that you can read on why some things are better than others to animate. But here's the general rule, okay? The most performant things to animate are position, scale, rotation, and opacity. You notice those first ones there, position, scale, and rotation. Those are all in the transform, property. So it's kind of just like transform and opacity. So you would say, like, where position, I'm not talking about position left, I'm talking about translate, right? Translate this X and Y. So these 4 things are the most performant things to translate. And I have a quote right here from Paul, Lewis, and Irish, who wrote an article together on html5rocks.com, and they're talking about these 4 properties, and the quote says here, if you animate anything else other than these 4, it's at your own risk, and the chances are that you're not going to have that silky, smooth 60 frames per second animation. And that's what we were talking about when we're talking about performance. Like the most performant things to animate are, transforms and opacity. Other than that, you might dip below 60 frames per second. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And the article is very good, so I recommend you go read that. There is a link in the description. And just to summarize, that these things do not cause a repaint of the elements, and they do not also cause a reflow of the layout, which are very costly in terms of browser rendering. These things, transform and opacity, will just basically change the element that they're targeting on, which is a lot more proficient in terms of browser performance. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, we know how to transform something, and we know what we should be transforming. Let's talk about triggering. How do you trigger a transform? In other words, how do you make one happen? Okay, it's not that hard. There's a lot of different ways, but the main two that you want to cover is by having the hover pseudo class. You hover over something and it transitions, and that could be either itself or a child of itself, and I'll show you how that works. The second one is a class change. So something is a normal element, and then you switch a class, but that class has the command or the style of it to transform, translate, transition. So there's always transition. So that the new class has the style of transition on it, and it'll just kind of like move it around based on the new class. And when you take that class off, it moves back. Right, so this is a great way to do a few things like menus or drop downs and things like that. And we'll talk about those in a second. That's it. That's all the talking that we're going to be doing. Now let's jump into some code and roll up your sleeves and get codey. Here we are in the code, and it's a very, very simple code just to start out with. We have the famous pink box, the pink box that we learned almost everything on. I love a pink box for some reason. Okay. And we're using Jade, which translates to HTML. So you see, like I clicked the view compiled. It's actually just a div with a class of box, but I just get a right box because I like Jade. And if you like Jade or you don't know what Jade is, check out the, Do You Even Jade Bro video and understand what the heck that is. And then for our CSS, we're using Sass. It compiles down to normal CSS. So if you don't like Jade, if you don't like Sass, that's okay. Normal HTML and CSS works for all of this stuff, and this is a code pen, so you can visit this code pen later. I'll have a link for that code pen in the description, and just like view compiled, so you can understand the HTML and CSS if you have a problem with that. But I don't care enough to do it for you. Just saying. So we have a pink box here. We have one HTML element called box. We have a body which has 50% or 50 pixels of padding, and I don't even know why we have a font color on that body. And then we have a box, which is an inline block, background pink, and a height and width of 200 pixels. Super basic, okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to transform this box. So, transform, and we'll just say translate. Translate means move. Let's say translate it 200 pixels that way, and then 150 pixels that way. So we're moving it to the right and down. And that's all fair. Let's rotate it a little bit. Let's rotate it like 20 degrees. Okay, now we see that we've just moved it and moved it down, but there was no transition. It's it just snapped right where it should be, right? So let's talk about this transition property. We'll write the transition. Let's get rid of our JavaScript. Move this up here. And so to transition them, to get that to animate down, we have to write a transition. And what do we want this transition to be? Remembering back to our syntax, we'll say transform is the property that we want to transition. And how long should it take? Let's say 300 milliseconds, which is just a good speed for your eyes to understand what's happening. And what's the next one? The timing function. We'll just use the classic ease in out. One of my favorites. It's easy to do and it looks good. And then the delay, we don't even want to put a delay on there. Okay, so I've saved it. What has happened? Nothing has happened. Why has nothing happened? Well, because the origination of the animation is never like, it's already there, right? So one way that you can really easily understand how something will transition is take the property that we're trying to transition and just quickly comment it out. Now we can see that there's some movement happening, right? Pop, 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 pop. Okay, so now there's no transform declared, so all of those values of transform, the translate and the rotate, are kind of zeroed out. But when we quickly add them, the transition will say, oh, I'm looking at transform. Let's do this. Let's take 300 milliseconds and ease it in a certain way for that transition to happen, right? Pretty simple. The next step to understand and use these things is to realize that the user is not going to be editing your CSS. We can't expect them to come in here and comment and uncomment your code, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and put the responsibility of triggering off into a hover. So box, let's say box hover. There you go. That's how you write that. And then in the hover, we want to put this transform. I'll just cut that and paste that here. Okay. So notice that the transition is always on the box. I used to get this confused when I first started. Like, where do I put the transition? On the hover because I want it to hover? No. You put the destination of the style on the hover. And the transition is always on the box looking for a change in this property. And when the hover happens, it says, oh, here's a change in this property. Let's do it over time, which is that time, right? Did you get all that? Okay, so let's hover over this, and we'll see that this transform will happen when we hover. Bam. You see that? All right. You see this little jittering here? That's a problem because what's happening is that our target, in other words, the box with the pseudo selector of hover is the target, and it is actually moving around. So this makes it pretty hard. And if you were to imagine that you're a user and you're trying to hover over the pink box and it's like flying around, and you're like, wait, I could follow down here. Okay, follow, what? So what we're going to do to combat this problem is actually offload the hover onto another element. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go up here and say trigger. This is going to be my triggering element. I'm going to put box as a child in that. So let me show you how that renders. The box is a child of trigger, all right? And then I'm going to go in here. Let's style the trigger up a little bit. Trigger, it'll be the same size, width 200 pixels, height 200 pixels, border 20 pixels, solid, and we'll say 999, and then background is going to be a good old DDD. Okay, we have this trigger element that's around the box element, and I'm going to offload this hover. So right now it's still hovering in the box. We still have this jittery problem. I'm going to offload the hover to trigger. And I'm not going to transform trigger, right? I'm not going to do that. That's not what I want. I still have the same problem. Look at the jittering. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say when trigger is hovered, then take box, the child of trigger, and transform that. Like that. Now it's really clear that this is the trigger, and then the box over here is the child that's being animated. And one interesting effect of this is that if you hover over box, we're going to have if you hover over trigger, obviously we have it triggering. But if you hover over box as well, which is a child of trigger, it's still triggered. So one way to overcome that is you could say, go to box here and say, what is it? It's pointer events, none. Now what pointer events does is it says don't register any hovers or clicks on this element. It's just an element that you cannot interact with, you can just see it. So when I hover over the trigger, obviously it's moving, but when I move that hover onto the box, it doesn't recognize any hovers or clicks on it. So we're going out there. This guy right here, pointer events, is super helpful when you're using like JavaScript or something later, when you need to interact with things and make sure some things don't trigger some things. So remember pointer events, it's a big one. When I realized what that thing was, when I learned pointer events, I was like, this is amazing. Why don't people talk about this thing more? It's kind of like this, we don't talk about it, but it's so powerful. All right. Anyway, pointer events, none. So that's hovering. That's the first part of this practical exercise. That's what we're going to show you there. What I want to do now is show you how to do the same thing, but with classes. Okay, so I'm going to pull up some JavaScript here, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to target the trigger and use on click. So when I click it, something's going to happen. The thing that's going to happen is this. Is this function. Okay, so this function here, we're going to say grab the trigger that you found, or the thing you clicked on, which is, well, we'll use the keyword of this, and just say toggle a class. toggle class of anything clicked. And so, toggle class means that if clicked is on it, then remove it. If it's not there, put it on. So when you click on the trigger, it'll get a class of clicked. So instead of saying trigger hover, we want to say trigger with a class of clicked is what we're going to do. So let's clicky, and it moves. Now this will stay when we're moving around, which is the nice thing of having JavaScript add classes. You don't need to rely on a hover, and you can click it and it'll go back, right? Because we're just toggling that class, and that class of clicked is what triggers this transform, right? That's what says we need it to be having a different type of transform, and because there's a transition already on it, looking at for transform changes, it will do a change. Got it? So one thing I want to show you more, just as kind of like a little bonus, and this is not necessarily related to how you trigger an animation, but it is fun to think about. This box here has obviously this animation on it. And the timing function is ease in out, and this will work for anything that you use timing functions on. But Chrome has this really great pop-up window that kind of shows you the thing over time. You see where this animation is more dense over here and sparser in the middle and more dense? That's because this curve here shows you over time that we're spending more time and then we're going up quickly and spending more time at the end. That's why it's like a softer transition, right? You can have different things where it's more dense in the beginning, so it'll be soft and then have a hard ending. Right? There's a lot of different kind of curves that you can use, and they all have keywords, right? In quadratic, out sign, things like that. You can also take these little handles and move them around yourself, which is cool. So like, see how it gets like a little pause in the middle? Something like this. Oh, there's like a little stutter. I wouldn't recommend that one, but the point is you can design these timing curves yourself. And these are called a cubic Bezier. And this code that's given right here is actually something you can copy and paste into your own code. I'm going to make this custom cubic Bezier a little more bouncy. And if I take this top point and move it over, see how it's 1.97? If it's over 1, that means it's outside of the box. That's why it's kind of like clipping here in the display. But what that does is it gives us this really kind of bouncy. So let me, I'm going to copy that, take it back over to my code, and replace the ease in out with this bouncy cubic Bezier. Let's move it over so you can see the whole thing in line. Okay, close, and see how it bounces? Boink, boink, boink. That's because my cubic Bezier is doing that. I'm not putting like, I'm not doing anything special other than saying like, make your Bezier way a weird curve, and this 1.97 will make it go like overshoot where it should be. So you can use cubic Beziers to give your animations these weird like, flourishes, or like a kind of a life that it would not otherwise have if you were using a keyword. And also, I can't remember where I heard this, but I believe that a cubic Bezier is more performant than using a keyword like ease in or ease in out or ease in sign or something like that, right? So that's all I wanted to show you with, actually one more thing. Triggering is important because you need to realize how to enact your animations. So I want to show you one more thing that you might think would work, but does not work with the transition property, okay? So let's go back and put this transform in box. Okay, so we already seen that the only way now to get it to transform is to remove the property from the CSS and not. I'm going to remove box from the trigger element, and then in here I'll say not toggle the class, but append a div with a class of box. Okay, so what this is doing, I'm using JavaScript to insert an element in the document inside of trigger with the class of box. Now, question. What do you think will happen? Do you think that the pink box will show up where it should be and then animate to where you would like it to be? Or do you think it would just show up in the ending state? Well, let's do a little click and figure it out. It ended in the ending state. Now, it shouldn't be all that surprising because we already have the transform already declared. A transition happens when there's a change in something. So when the box shows up and it just is already transformed, there's no change. So you can do this a few times, and there's all these boxes that got added to your document object, but they don't get an animation. Now this is the reason I'm bringing this up. I mean, you're going to be like, duh, Travis, why would you even bring this up? The reason I'm bringing this up is because there is a difference between transition, which we're looking at in this video, and animation, the CSS property, which we're looking at in next week's video. Okay, so next week, tune in, and we're going to be looking at the animation property, and that's going to be part 2 of the CSS animation series. Okay, and then it just animated away. This is Dev Tips, the YouTube channel. Thank you for watching this video on CSS animation. I'm really excited to share the rest of the series with you soon. Now, these videos are available to you because of the good work and the support that we get from the patrons of the community. Now, these people have visited patreon.com/devtips and made a donation of any amount of their choosing. And there are different, rewards and benefits, but mostly what you're doing right there is you're supporting the community, because these tutorials that I make are all for free, and people who could make a use of them to further their career, benefit their life, generate extra income or even income at all. I get a lot of emails from people saying that these dev tips have helped them to nail the job, right? Land a new job, get a new client, or whatever it is. And those emails really make me excited to do this work for you and for all you guys who are watching. And so if you want to contribute not just to the channel and say, hey, thanks, Trav, I appreciate it and I believe in what you're doing, but if you want to support the people who benefit from this channel, go ahead and visit patreon.com/devtips. And there's a whole community of their other perks and stuff, seeing the videos early, Dev Tips chat, monthly hangouts or semi-monthly hangouts, and it's a really exciting place to be. Free podcast, other things too. See you over at patreon.com/devtips, and I'll keep on hacking, and we'll see you next week when we're doing CSS animation property to learn more about CSS animations. Thanks, everyone.